Hello and welcome to It's Going to Be All Right. This episode is based off of a little bit of bad news due to a technical issue that had occurred while recording last week for this week's episode, which we were hoping to be on writing. We have lost one of the audio files for the podcast. So to try to keep with our regular release schedule and trying to work around having a podcast where Nicholas sits in one place and I sit in another, and we're bound to encounter some small technical issues from time to time. This is going to be a much shorter episode, and it's mostly going to go and focus around how we can move through writing and our writing and revision process by trying to compartmentalize our work. Now, unfortunately, Nicholas will not be joining me in this episode, and I'm also going to redirect you towards our NMBU Writing Center channel on YouTube for the visuals for what we call the revision roadmap. So the focus of what we intended to do last week was discuss the writing process, different ways in which people can think about their writing, different ways in which people can get organized and move through their writing. Now, from several years of working at the NMBU Writing Center, one of the major problems that I was encountering working with a lot of students from bachelor all the way up to PhD levels of education was when it came to writing, they found it very difficult to understand what it was that was most important to focus on as they started to revise and edit documents and drafts. And I started to realize one of the major problems was that feedback that students were getting from supervisors, from their course professors, so on and so forth, tended to be unfocused. It was looking at many different aspects of writing and not necessarily in an overly clear or coherent manner. And so the feedback that many of the students were getting was very difficult to decipher, to figure out what was relevant and important to focus on and to work on. And another major problem was that very often many of the students I was working with were also in the process of finalizing a first draft that they hadn't even written all the way to their conclusion. And they were already starting to get feedback to make revisions while they were still in the process of writing a first draft. What I started to realize is that this kind of compounded the issue of how do you figure out what is relevant to look at in the feedback and what is relevant to start revising when you haven't actually finished writing a first draft. All of this had led me to develop what we have called the revision roadmap at the NMBU Writing Center. And basically the point of it is to compartmentalize the writing process into different stages or steps. Each stage or step then has a very specific focus, which allows basically the writer to have a goal for each draft that they should make. And the way that we present the revision roadmap is you should think about, at a minimum, going through 5 revisions. The way that we want to start out is by thinking that stage 1 is just working from an outline and being able to have a well-constructed, well-developed outline that moves you from introduction to conclusion. And if you don't have that outline, then the writing and revision process is going to be very difficult. And that's what I had started to call the organizational block, or what we had discussed in episode 2, the issue of writer's block, more or less being caused by people not having their ideas well organized before they start to write. Once an outline is prepared, your primary goal should be to just write a first draft. And I think that this is where many people face a major problem. They try to make a first draft perfect by trying to edit and revise and spell check, do all of these very microscopic aspects of improving their writing before they have even finished a document. And what I have sort of found in my experience working with students is that if you're trying to revise while you're still trying to write a first draft, you're going to end up with some very nice polished sections. But as you start to run out of time and deadlines creep up on you, you end up having to rush finalizing the whole draft, and you get something that generally looks like it was rushed. You have sections that are very well written, well thought out, well organized. They have been proofread and spell checked and formatted, and then you get other sections that don't have any of those components going on because you had to rush to finish the writing. So, what you want for your very first goal with writing is to just have a first draft that moves from the introduction to the conclusion and basically contains as many necessary ideas as possible within your word limit. And the way that you do this is basically just follow your outline and recognize that your outline is going to need to be adjusted while you're writing. Your ideas will improve, maybe a new idea crops up, or you start to realize that one idea is less relevant than you thought it really would be. So having your outline beside you and making those small structural adjustments will be very useful. And once you have a first draft with all of those necessary ideas presented, then we can move on to more focused revision and improvement. Again, without that first draft, it's very likely that we're going to be focusing on the wrong parts of writing, or we're going to be trying to focus on too many aspects of improving our writing that it will become really difficult to know what is relevant to work on, and it will be difficult to see if you're actually making any improvements. So what we want to think about is as we move from our first draft, which is everything from our introduction to conclusion, we're not worrying about spelling, we're not worrying about punctuation, we're not worrying about grammar, we're not worrying about the clarity of our ideas. We just need to have everything there to work from. Moving towards our second draft, we can focus on aspects of the overall structure and flow and cohesion of that document. And one of the easiest things to work on is first looking at the structure. Is the writing that we present structured in a way that is logical? Are we following a good scientific writing structure? Are we moving our reader from general information towards more specific information? And a really good way that we can improve our structure in the second draft is to create a reverse outline of our first draft. And we can use that to then see, are the ideas we're presenting placed in a way that makes sense? And this is a really easy way then to find paragraphs or sections of our writing that might be irrelevant, that might be repeated and therefore redundant, or that might be illogically placed. And we can very easily move entire paragraphs or entire sections and revise them for better structure so that there's a more logical construction of those ideas. Now, if you're unclear on what a reverse outline is, you can go onto the internet and search it up. There's many, many good examples of how to perform it. But the main idea moving from draft 1 to draft 2 is that we really want to focus on making sure that we're reordering our ideas in a way that builds a more logical structure for the reader. And we're probably also going to need to add a bunch of information that is missing in the process of doing this. The next thing that we can do as part of this first to second draft revision is look at the overall flow or the transition of our ideas from paragraph to paragraph. And in the process of looking at that transition, we will also start to improve the structure by making more logical and more purposeful connections from paragraph to paragraph. And this is very easy to do if we follow what is called the Seec structure. We have information about this in our SWR 100 Canvas room for NMBU students and employees. And we also have this available on our YouTube channel that you can go and see what I mean by the Seec structure. But the idea is the Seec structure is a way of building paragraphs that are cohesive, that focus on a single idea, that state what the topic is about, provides examples and evidence and explanations of that, and concludes and builds a transition towards the next idea that we want to focus on. So the combination of the Seec structure for paragraph construction and thinking about logical transitions from concluding sentences to topic sentences of paragraphs will help to build that smooth flow and transition that also helps to improve the overall structure. Often what I see from the movement from a first draft to a second draft is a lot of reordering of our ideas, but we're not rewriting. I want you to keep in mind we're not starting from scratch. We're using what we already have and we're improving it by restructuring it and more likely than not needing to add more information that wasn't as apparent or wasn't as well formed when we wrote the first draft. So keep in mind, your second draft will probably get longer. And don't worry about your word count at this stage yet, because there are many ways that we can reduce our word count in the third and fourth draft. Once you feel that you have a good logical construction and flow and your ideas transition across the whole document from introduction to conclusion, and you feel that your paragraphs have become more cohesive and are following the Seec structure, we can then move away from looking at the construction of the whole document and the construction of sections more to the construction of the paragraphs and how we can tighten those paragraphs, make them clearer. So the goal for the third revision is to focus on clarity in your writing. And I think it's good to focus on paragraphs instead of focusing on individual words or sentences at this point. Part of the revision roadmap that I find to be so helpful is that we are always working from the bigger stuff down towards the smaller aspects of improving our writing. So when we come to our clarity, focusing on a paragraph level will really help out the process because we can more clearly work on one paragraph at a time instead of trying to look at every individual word and every individual sentence and every individual punctuation mark. So what do I mean by clarity? Clarity is basically how clear are your ideas to the reader. And some of the major causes of unclear writing come from an excessive use of unnecessary prepositions, as well as using vague pronouns, as well as interrupting your stream of consciousness. So what do I mean by these? Well, prepositions are words that we use to show a relationship, either in time or space, to other sorts of words. So words such as of, to, for, by, these are prepositions. They demonstrate a relationship between different objects or different nouns. And one of the most common prepositions that is overused in academic writing is the preposition of. Now, by focusing on paragraphs and looking for the instances of the word of, we can really start to understand how clear or unclear our writing is. And if we realize that we have a paragraph that is full of these prepositions, we might want to start restructuring and revising that paragraph to remove as many of those prepositions as possible. And a really good tool that you can use to help you do this is the Writer's Diet Test. And that is a free online revision tool that is available. You can search it up through any internet browser, any internet search engine. And what's really good about it is it will find these prepositions for you. You can also visit our YouTube channel where we demonstrate how you can easily and quickly remove these unnecessary prepositions, focusing on the preposition of to drastically reduce your word count and improve your clarity. So an example of unclear writing with lots of prepositions tends to be things that fall along the lines of this. It is because of the need to better understand the compartmentalization of writing that will help you to become a writer who is better at, so on and so forth. Realistically, we could improve the clarity of something like that by saying, compartmentalizing your writing for clarity improves understandability. It's much clearer, it's much more direct, it's much more to the point. So the prepositions are always a good place to start as you move into your third draft, and you'll notice how quickly your word count reduces without losing the message you're trying to get across. Vague pronouns, these are words such as it, this, that, these, them, those. Vague pronouns tend to reduce clarity because you might not always clearly explain to the reader what these pronouns are. Again, by using something like the Writer's Diet test, you can quickly find the instances of pronouns and try to think, what is the actual noun that I mean? When I say the word it, what does it really refer to, and will the reader understand what it means? This is a quick way to also improve the clarity for the benefit of your reader. Lastly, you can tighten up your paragraphs and also reduce your word count by removing interruptions. Interruptions in writing are quite common because we feel that we're adding more information that the reader should know, but one of the major problems with it is it breaks apart what is sort of the character and action. We separate what happened, who did it, why it was done, those sorts of things with additional information. And a quick way that we can find our interruptions is to look for instances of punctuation, most commonly commas or dashes. Often parentheses as well, but it's very common that we'll use commas to interrupt our ideas. So you can use your word processor and use the find or navigate or search function and just put a comma in and see how many instances of commas you use in your entire document. If you find that you have a section inside of a paragraph surrounded by commas, or surrounded by hyphens, or surrounded by parentheses, that is an interruption. And you need to ask yourself, is this information as relevant as I think? And if it is, can I move it somewhere else within this sentence? And see what happens if you take the interruption and move it to the start of the sentence or the end of the sentence. And does that help to clarify the idea? So these interruptions are a little bit more difficult to spot and think about, but remember, we're revising for the benefit of the reader and not for our own benefit as a writer. If possible, try to remove these interruptions if they seem like unnecessary information. If it is necessary information that helps to connect to something that came before or after the sentence inside of that paragraph, see if you can move that interruption to the start of the sentence or the end of the sentence to keep the clarity of your ideas. Now, as we move from a third draft towards a fourth draft, we're going to start looking at smaller and smaller aspects of writing. It would be at this point in the fourth draft that we're actually going to be carefully assessing every sentence in the entire document. And our main goal here is to focus on concise and precise writing. So what do I mean by this? Concise means how quickly you can get to the point, and concision helps to support clarity. The shorter and clearer sentences are, the better they are going to be understood. And what I mean by being precise is that you're using the most specific words possible. This is very hard to discuss in a podcast, and so I would recommend that you go and look at some of our resources on our YouTube channel to get more information on concision and precision. But basically, we want to be able to compress phrases down to a single word, if possible. We want to remove unspecific adjectives or adverbs, descriptive words that might not be as precise from a scientific standpoint as they would be from a literary standpoint. We also want to remove any irrelevant or redundant ideas that are still present within our document. Now, a really quick way that we can become more concise in our writing at this stage is use the word processor's navigation or search or find function and type in the word not, N-O-T. This would be an example of how we could compress phrases, because something that is not specific could easily be written as unspecific, a single word to replace two. It's at this point that we're really starting to cut down on our word count. We have a lot of good information on how you can compress other types of phrases. And you can also identify your unspecific adjectives and adverbs by running paragraphs or running sentences through the aforementioned Writer's Diet test. It becomes a bit more difficult to identify the irrelevant or redundant ideas, and that means that you need to have a very good control over the whole document, which hopefully by the fourth draft you do. As we move towards the fifth and what we might be able to consider a final draft, although I want to put a disclaimer there, final is never really final. There probably will be more revisions at this point, but from the standpoint of the revision roadmap, having these specific tasks to work on, wherever this would fall in your writing and revision process, the final step of the revision roadmap is proofreading and formatting. This is where we get to the most minuscule and microscopic aspects of writing, where we're examining individual words and punctuation marks to check our grammar, our punctuation, our spelling, correct use of tenses. This is where we're also checking our formatting to be sure that we are properly citing and referencing in the style that is demanded of us. And this is where we can consider finalizing things like the title of the article or the essay, our headers, our page numbers, so on and so forth. And I think that this is an overlooked side of the revision process because many people that I've worked with, they have their title in mind before they start writing. And I find this to be very problematic because they feel like they need to stick to their title. Their title is such a small part and should be one of the last things that is developed with your writing, because the title should reflect what the writing is about. It shouldn't be that your writing is forced to conform to a title. So if you feel like you are struggling through your writing and revision process, consider what your title might be, and consider that you could figure out what your title will be after you have finished writing and revising your writing. Same thing with your different section headers as well. These are minuscule formatting aspects that should not be taking up a lot of time if you're still working to write from your introduction to conclusion, if you're still working to improve your structure and flow and cohesion, or your clarity, or your concision and precision in writing. Don't allow yourself to be blocked or inhibited by aspects of proofreading, spell checking, or formatting if you don't feel that you have moved through all of these other stages of revision first. Again, this is a major problem that I have encountered over the years, that many of the students and even myself will tend to receive feedback that focuses more on proofreading and formatting aspects when we're still working at these much more macro scale aspects of revising, such as improving our structure or improving our clarity. So you may be receiving feedback from your supervisors, from your colleagues, from other people who are looking at these finalizing stages well before you have gotten there. So you need to be the judge of this for yourself. I am making a video that is going to be available this week on our NMBU Writing Center YouTube channel that describes the revision roadmap with visuals as well. So I would highly recommend that you go and check that out. It should be available either at the same time as the release of this podcast or a few days after. But you may find this to be an incredibly useful tool for you to help you through your writing process. We're hoping next week we will be back with a more regular release schedule, overcoming many of these technical issues. But I just hope that this little stopgap is enough to keep you listening, keep you entertained, hopefully to be useful for you. And again, I apologize that we don't have the podcast in its regular format for this week. But just wanting to say, it's going to be all right. It's going to be all right.